Hello everyone, welcome to another video of hepatic disorders. We were studying about hepatic disorders. It's been very long time, I know. I couldn't make time to record videos, but this is about it. So we were talking about chronic hepatitis and we were talking about the complications related with chronic hepatitis, right? So we had just completed hepatic encaph, treatment of hepatic encephalopathy. Now we'll be starting with HRS. So HRS is another complication of chronic liver failure, chronic liver disease. HRS is hepatorenal syndrome, right? It is a complication of cirrhosis. It is a complication of CLD. And it also accompanies SBP. What is SBP? SBP stands for spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, right? Now see, what happens is whenever there is acute or chronic liver failure, what I mean to say is that whenever liver is affected, LFT is going to be deranged, right? But whenever LFT is deranged and we send for KFT, that means urea, creat and all the other electrolytes. So when we send for KFT, and if there is a deranged KFT in setting of acute or chronic liver failure, then this is known as hepatorenal syndrome, right? So acute renal failure in acute or chronic liver failure or liver disease is known as HRS in histologically normal kidneys, which means that when we go for biopsy, then the kidneys are going to be normal. So histologically normal kidneys, but still the KFT is deranged, which means that the underlying mechanism of kidney damage is not related to kidney itself. It is due to underlying liver pathology, right? There are two types of HRS. According to Tentinalis, there is type 1 HRS and then there is type 2 HRS, right? So type 1 HRS is when there is progressive oliguria, which means what? That patient will complain of reduced urine output over days, right? And there will be doubling of creat over 14 days. So 14 days is the time in which the serum creatinine levels are going to double. Creat doubles, right? This is more serious. Type 1 is more serious. It is considered to be very irreversible. And median survival rate is without treatment is 2 weeks. So if a patient has type 1 hepatorenal syndrome, that the median survival rate is only 2 weeks, which means that if you do not treat this patient, the likelihood of patient surviving for another 14 days is very low, right? Then let's go to type 2. Type 2 HRS is when there is gradual impairment of renal function, but this may not progress. So there is going to be a gradual impairment, but it would not advance. It will not progress. So it is not going to be progressive. This is just impairment, right? And it does not advance beyond moderate dysfunction. So gradual impairment will be from mild, then it will advance towards moderate, but from moderate it does not go towards severe, right? And this is still better, but type 1 is very, very dangerous. Okay, so this was about HRS. Now there is a statement that is written in Tentinalis that if there is renal failure, I'm not talking about renal dysfunction can be mild, moderate, severe, whatever. If there is renal failure which is abrupt in a patient who has CLD or a patient who has cirrhosis, this is a marker of extreme morbidity, which means the outcome is not very, very good in these patients. So what it means is, I'll read out the statement for you. Abrupt renal failure in a cirrhotic patient that cannot be attributed to any other cause is a marker of extreme morbidity. So renal failure is a bad thing in CLD. So this was about hepatorenal syndrome. Now we are going to another complication of CLD, which is coagulopathy. So all of us know that liver is responsible for synthetic function, coagulation. So it is a dangerous complication. Why? Because dangerous complication. because if coagulation factors are not synthesized, then patient may bleed torrentially, right? So it needs to be treated. So how do we treat it? So there are three things that needs to be treated, right? There are three things that can happen in coagulopathy. One is that there can be vitamin K deficiency. One. Number two, there can be PT prolongation, prothrombin time. It can be prolonged. And number three is TCP, thrombocytopenia. If there is vitamin K deficiency, what are we going to give? We are going to give vitamin K. How much? Standard dose is 10 mg. It can be given IV, it can be given per oral. PT prolongation. Whenever there is prothrombin time prolongation, what do we give? We give fresh frozen plasma, FFP. And whenever there is thrombocytopenia, we need to give either RDP or SDP. RDP is random donor, single donor, right? So whenever there is thrombocytopenia, we need to treat it with platelets. Now, hepatic failure, next complication. So in a patient with CLD, patient can land up in hepatic failure, which means that the very small amount of liver which was actually working till now has stopped to work. This is the final common pathway. Patients will land up in hepatic failure sooner or later if they already have CLD, right? Because very small functional tissue is left and it may give up anytime. So this is the final common pathway. What are the comorbs that we should know? Diabetes is a comorbid, obesity is a comorbid, IV drug abuser, IV drug, alcohol, and hepatitis. So HBV, HCV, HIV, etc. If patient has, now this hepatic failure can be of two types, right? So it can be acute ALF, acute liver failure, or it can be chronic liver failure. Acute liver failure has an extremely poor prognosis. The survival is less than 30%. If you have 10 patients in ER who present with acute liver failure, chances are that only 2 will walk out and the rest 8 won't, right? They will die. So survival rate is very, very poor. Clinical hallmarks of acute liver failure. Let's go towards that. So clinical feature of acute liver failure is what we are going to understand right now. What are the clinical features? One is hepatic encaph, altered mental status, the 4 grades that we've read, right? Then hepatorenal syndrome, which means what? That apart from LFT, the KFT is also deranged, right? Then coagulopathy. So these are the clinical hallmarks. There are others also, like electrolyte imbalances, which we call as dyselectrolytemia. So electrolyte imbalances can be there, which can be very, very severe, related to sodium, potassium and all. There can be cerebral edema because of ammonia. There can be intracranial hypertension, and there can be negative nitrogen balance. Apart from this, there are many other clinical features also, of which some important ones are hypotension. So this is a difficult situation to handle because patient is already in volume overload and patient also lands up in shock, in hypotension, right? So this becomes very difficult to treat. Apart from this, there can be hypoglycemia also because of synthetic function of liver is gone, so it causes lot of hypoglycemia, recurrent hypoglycemia also. Then there can be adrenal insufficiency. So all of this is also a clinical feature of acute liver failure. What does this need? It requires very, very careful, this patient requires very, very careful ED care actually. Plus it also requires LTP consult, liver transplant unit consult, because if liver has failed so badly, we need urgent liver transplant consultation, right? What is the treatment for acute liver failure in ER? We start with our ABCs, right? So airway, breathing, circulation is our first management, first line. Then we look at electrolytes. So if there is any dyselectrolytemia, we have to correct that. Then we look at INCAF. So hepatic INCAF, we know what are the anti-HE measures. I've already told. So all those medicines needs to be started. Apart from this, we need to identify if there is intracranial hypertension, right? And then we need to correct that also by a diuresis. So identify intracranial hypertension or increased like intracranial tension, right? That is all. Now, if it is being asked that can we take BiPAP support for patients with CLD who come in acute liver failure and patient is drowsy, then no, we cannot use BiPAP. Why? Because there is very, very high risk of aspiration. This is what we know already, right? So aspiration risk is very, very high. We do not give BiPAP to patients who are drowsy. BP. I've told you that patient is going to land up in hypotension. Can we give lots and lots of fluid? The answer is no. Patient is already having third spacing of fluid. Patient is already ascitic. Patient has gross ascites mostly. Most likely patient is already going to have pedal edema. Patient is already going to be in volume overload. So we can give initial fluid challenge, but it has to be very, very judicious. Right? Apart from this, we have to take the patient on pressor support. So first we take on NORAD and then we take the patient on vasopressin, right? The catch with vaso is that this vasopressin can cause increased intracranial tension. Why? Because it causes cerebral vasodilation. Dilatation. So we have to use vaso with caution. But otherwise we can use NORAD. Also, there is question that do we need to give steroids? So yes, hydrocort should be given, right? So hydrocort trial should be given. It actually increases pressor sensitivity. So demand of pressure, like the dose of pressure can be reduced if we give steroids along with it, right? Now, let's talk about fulminant liver failure, AMS. If a patient presents in AMS, patient presents in altered mental status, who is a known case of liver failure, right? Who is a known case of CLD, who is a known case of cirrhosis, etc., etc. If a patient presents with AMS, what do we think of? So there can be two possibilities. One, you can think of hepatic INCAF, and other you have to think of first is ICH. So we never think about hepatic INCAF. This is only after neuroimaging we diagnose patient with hepatic INCAF. Otherwise, if a patient with liver failure comes with altered mental status, drowsiness or anything else, first we have to rule out bleed, right? Or there can be increased intracranial tension as told right now, right? Or there can be cerebral edema. So first we have to get a CT done and rule this out and see these, and then only we have to think about HE, right? Why do we think that way? Because see, if a patient has liver failure, already we know that the patient is having coagulopathy, and patient is having coagulopathy, which is a very huge risk factor for bleeding. So patient can bleed, no issue about it, right? Then what about cerebral edema? Why are we thinking about cerebral edema? Because see, if a patient has hepatic INCAF, patient will have HRS. Most of the patients will have. So what is going to happen? Patient is also going to have renal failure. Apart from renal failure, patient will have increased ammonia. This is what we know. Plus patient is going to have hypotension. All of these things predisposes the patient towards cerebral edema. Is this okay? So we are thinking about cerebral edema because patient has HE, has renal failure, ammonia is too much, or ammonia is osmotically active, so it will draw fluid inside. Plus patient is hypotensive, right? So perfusion is reduced. This can cause cerebral edema. Now see, prophylactically, can we give NS? So yes, prophylactically 3% NS can be given. Sodium level is 145 to 155 milliequivalent per liter. So if you are suspecting that patient may have cerebral edema, do we give mannitol or 3% NS? We give first 3% NS prophylactically. But if you have confirmed that yes, ICP is raised, right? If you confirm that there is increased intracranial pressure, then you have to give mannitol. And what is the dose of mannitol? Dose of mannitol is 0.1 to 1 gram per kg, right? In our hospital, we do not give such high dose, but yeah, this is what is given. Also, we have to talk to neurosurgery team, right? So neurosurgery consult is also to be taken whenever there is evidence, whenever there is confirmed increased intracranial pressure, right? So this was about AMS. This was about management of acute liver failure, etc. So let's go ahead now. And now we will be studying about NAFLD. What is NAFLD? NAFLD is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, right? So this starts from steatosis, which means fat deposition, and steatohepatitis, which means fat deposition plus inflammation of liver, and it progresses towards cirrhosis. So these innocents have not had alcohol, but still they end up in CLD, right? So these innocents didn't drink, but they ate, right? So they eat a lot. These patients are obese. Obesity and metabolic syndrome are the two most common and most strongly correlated. These two are most strongly correlated with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is very shocking to know that after hepatitis C related CLD, this is the second most common diagnosis for liver transplant, right? So for liver transplant, hep C related CLD, we go for liver transplant. After that, we go for liver transplant in patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Okay. What is the most common manifestation? Most common manifestation is what we see in every patient, every single patient, that is fatty liver. If you have followed patients in your ER, you will realize that every second patient has at least a grade 1 or a grade 2 fatty liver. Grade 3 is still rarer, but grade 1 and grade 2 is so common in ER, so common, and it is such an incidental finding, patients don't even know. Most common manifestation is this. Now, so in ED, it is an incidental finding. There can be mild OTPT derangement. It can be increased, mild, like not very important. Mild abdominal pain, mild nausea, that is all right. So steatosis is benign. Fat deposition is benign. But steatohepatitis has the tendency to progress. So steatohepatitis is a progressive condition, right? Is there any treatment for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? The answer is no. So there is no medicines available for NAFLD. So what is the treatment? The treatment is only lifestyle related. So what is it? We will ask the patient to exercise more, weight loss, exercise. Apart from this, there are few drugs that are used, like some antioxidants may be used, right? Then some AC inhibitors may be used, statins may be used, right? But these are not standard treatment. There is not a single mention to use all these, right? So treatment of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is only weight loss, exercise, and lifestyle modification. Lifestyle modification, right? Now, let's talk about genetic and autoimmune liver disorders. So, genetic disorders, if somebody asks me about genetic hepatic disorders, first thing that comes to my mind is always Gilbert's. I don't know why, but that happens. So, on and off, you will see that the LFT is deranged. On and off. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it gets deranged. It does not have much effect on liver, right? So no effect on liver as such. But when there is autoimmune hepatitis, when there is primary biliary cirrhosis, when there is alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, when there is Wilson disease, and when there is hemochromatosis, all these have a tendency to progress towards CLD and failure. So what are we going to do in such patients? Liver transplant consultation, right? Now, let's talk about venous thrombosis. So, there are many patients in ER that you will see CLD with portal hypertension, with PV thrombosis, with partial PV thrombosis. So, that is a very common diagnosis in ER whenever we are looking at patients. So, let's talk about that. So, there is portal venous thrombosis. So, this affects mostly the prehepatic portal venous system is most commonly affected, prehepatic ones, right? It is associated with hypercoagulable states. Then, so see, coagulation is deranged in CLD, right? So how is this happening? This is happening in other patients also, like patient having abdominal trauma, some blunt trauma, right? Then there could be sepsis, which induces PV thrombosis. Pancreatitis, most importantly, causes PV thrombus formation, cirrhosis, and hepatocellular carcinoma, right? If, like, there are two types of thrombosis again, so it can be a acute thrombosis or it can be chronic thrombosis. If the patient is having acute PV thrombosis, patient will complain of colicky abdomen pain, and there will be venous congestion. We cannot pick this up, right? But still, venous congestion in small intestine walls, but we won't be able to pick this up, right? Only through ultrasound. If we see the thrombus, then only we can pick up. Otherwise, it's not very commonly picked up in ER. Chronic is painless incidental finding, no pain. It is an incidental finding. While doing ultrasound, they will see that, oh, echo texture is coarse, patient has CLD with portal vein thrombosis, right? It is a long-standing condition. So what happens is that there are many small collaterals that can get formed because it is existing since quite long. So the body adapts. So what happens is there are formation of many collaterals. So collaterals are formed. And these collaterals, what they do, they compensate. So what happens is the patient does not have many complaints. It is painless, right? So now what happens is, if this portal vein thrombosis is even long-standing, even more long-standing, then what happens is known as cavernous transformation of portal vein. What is this condition? So vein was actually like this earlier. Now what happens? It becomes like a cavernous. What is cavernous? Cavernous means type of a lake actually, right? It is a dilated segment. So portal vein gets transformed into a, looking like a cavernous, right? So cavernous transformation of portal vein is this, and there are multiple collaterals which gets formed around the portal vein. So it starts to look like a sphere instead of a cylinder. So this is cavernous transformation. Now, this was about portal vein thrombosis. So portal vein, we know where this is. So it is here somewhere, right? Now let's talk about hepatic vein thrombosis, which is here, right? It goes to the inferior vena cava. So here if there is thrombosis, then what is going to happen, that we are going to study now. Hepatic vein thrombosis is also known as Budd-Chiari syndrome. What is Budd-Chiari syndrome? So it is thrombotic obstruction. Now this thrombus can be anything, right? It can be tumor, it can be compression from outside, it can be lymph node, it can be clot, right? Thrombus, which we know. So it can be many things. So thrombotic obstruction of post-hepatic portal venous system. Hepatic portal venous system. So this is going to present as how? Same. It is going to present as abdominal pain, but not colicky pain. This is going to be a dull, boring pain, right? Apart from this, what is going to happen? There is going to be hepatomegaly, obviously, because blood is going to accumulate in liver. Plus there is going to be ascites, right? Now the problem with hepatic vein thrombosis is that it is going to damage the liver, right? So what it is going to it is going to progress very, very quickly into fibrosis. It is going to progress very rapidly into cirrhosis, and it is going to very rapidly cause liver failure. That is why with portal hypertension and with portal vein thrombosis, we generally do not take up the patient very urgently. But if a patient gets diagnosed with hepatic vein thrombosis, then it is an actually emergency, because if this thrombus stays for long, it is going to cause pressure effect on the hepatocytes and will cause necrosis of the hepatocytes. Finally, patient is going to land up in cirrhosis, and we know that cirrhosis is an irreversible condition, right? What are the risk factors for hepatic vein thrombosis, which we need to keep in mind? Patient with known coagulopathies, right? If a patient already has some hematological disorder, known coagulopathies, then if we know that patient has some myeloproliferative disorders, right? So what is the myeloproliferative disorder, which we have to think most importantly is polycythemia vera. Then if there is any infection, if patient is a known case of PNH, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria or hematuria, or if the patient has congenital webs in inferior vena cava. See, finally hepatic vein is going to drain into inferior vena cava. So if at the level of inferior vena cava there are any obstructions, that will also cause hepatic vein thrombosis, right? Features of that. What is the treatment? So if there is no cirrhosis, like this is a new finding and there is no damage as of now, then we have to start with anticoagulation. Why? Because we have to dissolve the clot ASAP. But if the patient already has cirrhosis, we know that the coagulation profile is deranged, right? There is increased risk of bleeding. So in this time, we cannot give anticoagulation. So no anticoagulants are given in patients with established CLD, in patients with established cirrhosis. What do we do this time? We have to do clot removal. So clot removal is done by TIPS, or we do surgical shunting. Any of these can be done, but we cannot give blood thinners, we cannot give anticoagulation in such patients, right? Now, what is the disposition and follow-up for patients with CLD? See, a patient with chronic liver disease are typically patients of the gastro department, right? Whenever they present to the ER, they are either presenting with some complication of CLD, which is like hepatic incaf, or some coagulopathy, some active bleeding, hematemesis, melena, etc. Or patient is presenting with other spectrum like infective, like SBP, fever, abdomen pain, etc. Right? So these are the only things which we treat in ER. And finally, disposition is admission mostly. Mostly we admit the patients, right? So if a patient presents with acute hepatitis, what do we do is we will give supportive treatment, because that is the only treatment, right, for acute hepatitis. Liver will heal on its own, right? If patient is unresponsive to treatment, does not respond to treatment, if the patient is a pregnant lady, if the patient is an elderly person, right, If these are the spectrum of patients you are dealing with, you have to admit the patient, right? If the patient has bilirubin of more than 20, obviously you have to admit. If the prothrombin time is more than 50%, or if the patient has hypoglycemia again and again, these are red flags, you again have to admit the patient, right? There is rare chance of patient in acute hepatitis presenting with bleed, but if patient is bleeding, admit instantly. Let's talk about chronic hepatitis. If patient presents to ER and they are known case of chronic hepatitis, you have to look for SBP. What is SBP? SBP is fever, acidosis, abdominal pain, increased TLC count, WBCs are raised, right? Abdominal tenderness. If you are suspecting SBP, spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, then you have to admit the patient, right? If patient has hyponatremia, admit the patient. If patient has hypovolemia or hypovolemia, if patient has hypotension, you have to admit the patient. So we know actually if ABCs are compromised, if patient's mental status is compromised, if you are suspecting something critical, admit the patient. That is all. Mostly patients with CLD or with acute hepatitis get admitted. There are very rare patients who will get discharged on ED basis. Most patients get admitted, right? Let's talk about pain control in patients with CLD, right? These are special considerations. In Tintinalis, there is a special heading given, special considerations. See, what do you think about NSAIDs in CLD? We all know that NSAIDs are nephrotoxic. So whenever patient is a known case of CKD 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever stage, we try and not give NSAIDs in such patients. But if a patient is having CLD, established cirrhosis, do you think that we can give NSAIDs or not? We do not give, right? We avoid. Why? Because NSAIDs are also gastrointestinal toxic, GI toxic. We know that it causes gastric ulcers, etc., right? So if patient presents with pain, what do we give? First of all, we give paracetamol, our favorite. For other patients, the maximum dose goes up to 4 grams, but for liver patients, the maximum dose goes up to 2 grams per day, right? Then, talking about gabapentin, pregabalin, these are also safe. So if you are suspecting some neuropathic pain, you can give at the standard dose, right? Opioids, tramadol, morphine, nalbuphine, etc. avoid. But Fenta, do you know fentanyl? Fentanyl and tramadol, these two can be given. Why? Because these two do not have no toxic metabolites. So what I mean to say is that opioids are going to have toxic metabolites, so we avoid opioids in patients with CLD. Why? Because metabolism occurs through liver is compromised, it will not be metabolized, so it is going to accumulate, and since the metabolites are toxic, so it is going to cause more harm than benefit. But in Fenta and tramadol you can give because metabolites are not toxic. If necessary, then only you give, otherwise give PCM. Paracetamol is the safest of all, right? Now let's talk about dose adjustment, right? So see, very, very important thing we need to know right now. There are 3 type of drugs, right? So if it has high hepatic extraction, intermediate and low hepatic extraction, what this means is that if a drug, I took a drug A, right? Now what happened is that as soon as I took it, most of the drug got metabolized by liver and rendered ineffective, right? So what happened is that I will take higher dose initial as well as higher maintenance dose. Why? Because every time I'm taking drug A, just think of it as drug A, whenever I'm taking drug A, most of the drug is getting metabolized by liver and a very small quantity of drug is left for its action. This is drug A. Now I'm talking about drug B. What happens is that whenever I'm taking drug B, some amount is getting metabolized and some amount is still left for it to act. And drug C is that whatever I'm taking, most of it is showing its effect in the body and some part of it is getting metabolized by liver. This is how normally drugs are working in the body. This is what I'm telling about normal patient, right? Patient who does not have liver disease. Now, just imagine if I give drug A to a patient who has CLD. Will the liver work? Will the liver work? No, the liver is not working. So the drug which was initially supposed to be metabolized wholly by liver and only a very small fraction was left to show its effect. Now what is happening is that entire amount is available, entire amount is showing its effects, right? Why? Because there is no hepatic extraction. So for drugs with high hepatic extraction, the initial dose is low and the maintenance dose is also low, which means what? We need to show dose adjustment for initial dose also, for maintenance dose also. Let's talk about intermediate. For intermediate, we have to put initial dose low normal and maintenance dose low. And for low hepatic extraction, initial dose can be same, but maintenance dose has to be reduced. Think about this slide once. Think about this part again. You will be able to understand what I'm saying. There are 3 types of drugs. One which gets extracted very fast by the liver. Second, intermediate extraction. Third is slow extraction. But if patient has CLD, it will not show high or intermediate hepatic extraction. It is going to show low hepatic extraction by default because tissues are not working. Think about this, you will be able to understand this. It took me some time to get it inside my head. There are a few drugs which needs to be dose adjusted as per Tintinallis. I'll show you. Just a second. Yeah, this is the table I was talking about. See, what we need to know here is few drugs which we actually use in ER very frequently. Analgesics, morphine, reduce initial and maintenance dose. Okay, then promethazine, not very commonly used. Sumatriptan, not very. Midas, anxiolytis, midazolam, we have to reduce initial as well as maintenance dose. Okay, labetalol, again same. Calcium channel blocker, nicardipine, reduce initial and maintenance dose. NTG, nitroglycerin and isosorbide dinitrate, we have to reduce the initial and maintenance dose. Let's talk about intermediate hepatic clearance. So codeine, amiodarone. Okay, amiodarone we have to know, antiarrhythmics. Amiodarone we have to reduce initial dose to low normal, but maintenance dose has to be reduced, right? Lidocaine also, ciproflox, Haldol, right? So antipsychotics, haloperidol, we have to give the normal initial dose, but maintenance dose has to be reduced. Olanzapine, clozapine, omeprazole, ranitidine, alprazolam. We tend to give anxiolytis very frequently in patients with HE. So alprazolam, initial dose can be the same, but if we are giving maintenance, then we have to reduce. Same for diazepam, lorazepam. That is all. You can go through this table once, it's important. So finally we come towards the end of this long chapter. We will be starting with some other chapter now. Also, I've started preparing for MRC EM part 2. Videos are planned to be out soon. I'm not getting much time because of my duties. But yeah, I'll think of making it work somehow. So thank you very much for watching. We'll be starting with a new chapter very soon. See you then. Thank you.